Trust in legacy media is at a historic low. Coincidentally, independent media's rise is being threatened by a raft of censorship laws across the world, plus a cartel of legacy media and big tech institutions working together to choke off competition. What a weird coincidence! Hello there, you Awakening Wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom, a voyage that we must take together using independent media and independent thought, because legacy media apparently, evidently, and plainly has a relationship with big tech, big business, big pharma that prohibits them communicating openly with us. Our free thinking is their problem. They've lost the territory of our collective psyche and they want it back. Today you will learn about the Trusted News Initiative, a group of organizations, state-funded, corporate-funded, legacy media organizations and big tech platforms that work together to control media narratives and shut down opposition. No wonder that trust in the legacy media is at an all-time low, whether that's events during the pandemic, the inability to report openly on the war, new censorship laws being passed in Ireland, Canada, the UK, the EU, across the world to stifle and shut down independent media and independent thought, always, of course, under the auspices of preventing hate speech, because you know what legacy media really care about? Your feelings. That's why they're investigating the events around the pandemic so intrepidly. That's why they're investigating excess deaths. That's why they're spending all this time ensuring that big pharma are held to account. Right, those things aren't happening, are they? That's why legacy media is in trouble. That's why these censorship laws are being passed, and that's why the Trusted News Initiative has been formed. Before we get into explaining this complex cartel of big tech and legacy media and how they propagandize global media events, let's have a look at how trust in legacy media is failing and falling.
Trust, or the lack thereof, one of the elements that really stood out in our exclusive News Nation poll. Nearly 80% of Americans admit they are concerned about the pandemic, but who they trust to tell them about it is mixed. We know one thing, that they don't trust the media, unfortunately, and only about 15% say they trust the president right now.
The big cable outlets range from about 3.5 to almost 5 out of 10.
The reason we don't trust the media is because I think we've started to understand that the function of the media is to amplify the message of the establishment and to cut out and discredit counter narratives, to destroy opposition and dissent wherever possible, sometimes working together in a coordinated way. For example, during the pandemic, horse paste and ivermectin. I personally have been subject to coordinated media attacks that have been astonishing. And to be at the center of something like that is terrifying. It's only the fact that no one trusts the legacy media that gives me any comfort at all. But this goes way beyond me in my situation. This is a global phenomena of failing trust in legacy media, and it relates to the rise of independent media. And independent media, of course, is just a conduit to you and your ability to freely think. The advantage that we have in our space is we're continually interacting. We're looking at your comments continually. You point out, no, that's a fake whistleblower. We don't care about this UFO story. They're using that. That's a false flag. You remain in connection with your audience, and you don't have a relationship, or we don't have a relationship, I assume, let me know in the chat, where you just bombard people with information that amplifies the message of the powerful, and you find out, oh, hold on a minute, this was funded by some weird NGO. This comes from a think tank with some explicit connection to big pharma. Wait a minute, the military-industrial complex benefit from those stories being told that way. These pundits haven't disclosed their connection to big pharma or Lockheed Martin or whatever issue it is. Hang on a minute, people in Congress own stocks and shares. Independent media is changing the way that we think and communicate and even vote. And that's where it's becoming an enormous problem. And that's what the Trusted News Initiative is all about. They have decided that legacy media are no longer competing with one another. They are united together to control a narrative and choke out competition. And competition means independent media, which ultimately just means you, because you are the audience. You're the ones that are turning away from legacy media. Thank God.
Newspapers topped 5 out of 10, with local papers scoring higher. And when it comes to trust, local TV news did the best, but still only with a 5.6 out of 10 rating.
Even that small piece of information there is an indication that what people want is decentralization and connection, isn't it? That's what we all want. We recognize that we don't have any agency or purchase or control in our own lives, that our communities are being governed from elsewhere, that even our nations are being governed from elsewhere. A few simple examples are the WHO's new treaty would enable them to dictate to your country what measures will be taken in any future pandemic. The WHO's community guidelines are are used to determine what's sayable and not sayable on YouTube. The WEF seems to be able to create political leaders and political figures in nations across the world, whether it's New Zealand or Canada or our country, the UK, various politicians with odd connections to the WEF. This is what's meant by globalism. Globalism requires a compliant media that will always deliver the messaging that they require and will never house independent, oppositional or dissenting voices. Nearly 60% see mainstream media as a threat to democracy. Why wouldn't you when you've seen how January 6th has been reported on, for example, and exploited? UK has second lowest level of trust in press in a survey of 24 countries. The media is not the public. Often you will hear public opinion demands this. It's not public opinion, it's the media class. They're completely out of touch with the public. The next time you look at a legacy media outlet, look at the contempt they feel for ordinary people. You can hear it, you can see it, you can read it. There's a kind of a sneering, dripping insidiousness when it comes to talking about the cultural issues that affect your life, that affect people that are from ordinary backgrounds. This is something that they detest and despise and want to control. It's evident in their reporting, and of course, trust is being lost as a result. Understandably. America's trust in media remains at near record low. Trust in media so low that half of Americans now believe that news organizations deliberately mislead them. Of course, we have a fantastic example of legacy media compliance, if not corruption, then coordination when it comes to reporting around the pandemic and in particular around the new medications that were introduced during that period. Even though it's only been a short period of time, the magnitude of this $15 billion campaign and its impact and its enthusiasm and its tone-deaf style are already astonishing. Have a look at some of the media. This is not even advertisements. This is mainstream entertainment that just carried the message of the establishment of Big Pharma during the pandemic period. Now, let's not pretend that you couldn't look at this favourably. They recognised there was a crisis. They believed that the vaccine was the solution. They had to get on board and persuade people it was the best thing to do. But in the light of excess deaths, in the light of the Wuhan lab leak theory becoming more and more appropriate, in the light of adverse injuries being reported, in light of the fact that we now know that it probably would have been better to have had a very different approach to lockdown, social distancing, now that we know that many of our political leaders didn't even abide by those laws, now that we know that numerous public officials have gone on to work for Moderna and Pfizer, now we know that information was being incredibly controlled, how inadvisable does some of this legacy media propaganda look just a couple of months later?
President Biden's chief medical advisor says people need what he calls trusted messengers.
The White House has now recruited TikTokers, YouTubers,
including some very big celebrities, on how to direct their followers to trusted vaccine content.
Build is one of the largest public education campaigns ever. The goal, convince Americans, get the COVID vaccine.
It's vaccination day. It's vaccination day. It's vaccination day. Today I get my COVID jab.
One of the things that's astonishing is the way that it skips through various demographics to make sure that no cultural or social group will be left out. Just in the first 10 seconds, we've seen what you might call white bread folks from a middle class community encouraging their children to get up for those vaccines. We're moving into tweens or teens, but tick off the demographics as we move through the montage because they don't want one arm left unjabbed. They better be certain about this product. They seem certain about something.
And I'm feeling really fab. For months I have been waiting for this day. R-O-N-A-V-I-R-U-S-19.
It seems that African Americans are skeptical about this product, perhaps because of the way they've been historically treated by systems of power. Could we possibly do some hip-hop propaganda? I don't see why not, sir.
Masked up with my team to smash back the disease, and we dreamed about the day that we'd have a vaccine. Yeah, now that human-made miracle is finally here.
It's Megan Thee Stallion, Ariana Grande, and Jimmy Fallon. Y'all know what time it is. It's time to get those boosters.
Ain't no real life, you need to vax that thing up. Feeling freaky all night, you need to vax that thing up.
If you wanna get sticky and hot, go get the shot.
Grab your syringe, but make sure you clean it. And stick it in me like you really mean it. It sounds so sexy to a knock.
Gone through hip-hop, gone through non-cis or gay community. We're moving into some weird new sexy Michael Bublé territory now.
Vaccine, till I get the vaccine. Vaccine, you come for vaccine.
Whether it's Moderna or whether it's Pfizer, we're staying alive.
humour and irony, every single tool being deployed. And we could give you some statistical information, certainly as provided elsewhere, that shows that the degree of hyperbole and bombast was at least inadvisable. That maybe some of this money should have been spent on clinically trialling on more than 8 mouses. In the first 9 months of 2023, America lost more young people than it lost in all its wars since Vietnam. That's statistical information that's only available because insurance companies have had to adjust their premiums. We've got our working out. We're not giving you propaganda. We're giving you facts. And notice how there's no hate speech here either. Curious.
Oh, I just can't wait for vaccine.
But what about little kids? What about little kids? But there's no evidence to suggest... Quiet! Get me Simba, you bastards! And then there's late night metropolitan folk? Yes.
Everybody, it's time to vaccinate. Faster, no time to waste.
What about non-white folks?
No more cutting your own hair now. Vaccine's on its way.
Isn't it odd that they did all this? Isn't it, like, just with a little bit of perspective provided by the passing of time? Doesn't it seem extraordinary that this is the amount of money that was spent? Don't you think what would be more appropriate is there are these vaccines available. We're obviously not entirely sure of how effective they are because it's not been time to clinically trial them. If you're a member of a vulnerable community, your comorbidities, or you're of a certain age, you possibly want to consider them. And as you know, there are shielding measures in place for just such a community. We should be honest with you. A lot of things we've said that were imperial trialing when it comes to lockdown measures were just based on computer modelling, and that's not the same thing at all. We've got a whole host of voices, dissenting voices from Harvard and Stanford University and brilliant medical experts, including some people who worked on the development of mRNA technology, to give you a global perspective on what could be the benefits and risks of this medicine. And you can decide for yourself. This is, after all, America or the UK or wherever this propaganda is being broadcast, but let's face it was broadly speaking in the United States. You decide for yourself. Why was that not the approach? Just spend some time thinking about that. Then consider for a moment when there were dissenting voices, whether they were voices in academia or entertainment or tennis, Novak Djokovic. Look at the amount of effort that similarly went into crushing them. I recently, of course, myself have been subject to a coordinated, massive media hate campaign where numerous media companies worked together using extraordinary and unprecedented measures, making astonishing claims, immersive reporting for a couple of weeks. Have we seen anything like this before? Yeah, all the time. This is how the media operates. How can you get legacy media organizations to coordinate and cooperate across the world? Almost as if they've got some sort of weird alliance, are in part connected to the pharmaceutical industry, and have a declared and explicit agenda to crush independent media, ensuring that a propagandist message can reach the population without ever being challenged. Because obviously what's suggested by the new technology that we have access to now is decentralized models, more and more individual bespoke systems of government control and communication, and that is a threat to who? The interests of the powerful. And who are the legacy media? They are the mouthpieces of the powerful. They are not their opponents. They are not investigating them. They're not investigating excess death. They're not investigating corruption in places of great power. They are attacking dissenting voices. It's not a coincidence.
It's what we've been waiting for, to embrace all that life has in store. It's time to make new memories. Once you got the vaccine, hug your family. It's time to hug your family. Feeling so relieved. Oh, yeah, we're feeling so relieved.
I've worked inside legacy media and Hollywood. I've been part of those institutions, so I'm not suggesting that there's any malfeasance on the part of the participants. I'm sure that it's just like, we're just doing this thing today. It's great. The vaccines are available. It's going to save a lot of people. Again, as George Carlin says, you don't need a conspiracy where interests converge.
These people went to the same universities and fraternities. They're on the same boards of directors. They're in the same country clubs. They have like interests. They don't need to call a meeting. They know what's good for them.
But it's doubtlessly not a coincidence that a significant portion of legacy media funding comes from the pharmaceutical industry. It's not a coincidence that government agencies, as we reported last week, spent significant sums on promoting lockdowns and vaccine messaging. So I'm not saying that any of the participants, the dancers or pop stars or TV personalities, are part of some evil cartel. I'm saying that Big Pharma and legacy media and the government are working together, and we can prove it.
No lockdowns, we're free.
Okay, very helpful. I'll get a vaccine. It is safe, isn't it? We've not had time to trial that. We spent all the money on the dancing. Let's have a look at the Trusted News Initiative and some dissenting voices within legacy media who are pointing out just how much they've been censored and how much control is asserted by these interests. You know this already, but there's facts. In July 2021, almost 30 journalists banded together to object to censorship and fear-mongering about COVID-19 that they say has been put out by the media and tech giants since the pandemic began. The group, who have called themselves Holding the Line, Journalists Against COVID Censorship, have argued that attempts to share concerns counter to the one official narrative or one scientific truth have led to reporters being criticised by their managers, freelancers being blacklisted, and the public receiving a distorted view of the truth. The 26 Holding the Line members work across UK newspaper groups, broadcasters and PR as staffers and freelancers. Most asked to remain anonymous to protect their employment, but some were happy to be named, including broadcast producer and former BBC journalist Tony Gosling. They said they want to encourage best practice, create a prejudice-free environment for journalists who have concerns, raise awareness of lesser reported issues, and raise concerns about censorship from tech giants like YouTube, which take down coronavirus misinformation. They listed perceived failures, including a lack of context for statistics, due coverage for alternative treatments, scrutiny of PCR testing, attention to adverse vaccine reactions, or balanced examinations of the costs of lockdown. A little while later, we now know that these were all legitimate areas for rigorous inquiry, and that each of those areas, if investigated correctly, would have yielded incredible information. We now know about adverse injuries. We now know about excess deaths. We now know about how the conclusions to lock countries down were fudged and convenient for certain sets of interests. All of this, if you had a media that was accountable, would have been undertaken. But you don't have that. You have a media that works as part of a cartel. The Trusted News Initiative, we'll be telling you more about that in a second. And they accuse the UK media of frequently publishing fear-inducing and sometimes inaccurate coverage, helping to foster a hostile environment for those who choose not to have a COVID-19 vaccine. One member, Elijah, told Press Gazette it's been unprecedented the way COVID-19 has been reported in the UK, but not just in the UK, worldwide. There's only been one official narrative played out in the mainstream media, and that has not changed over time. There's only been one scientific truth allowed to be discussed, the one endorsed by worldwide government regulatory bodies. Even that has been very selective. This has given the public a distorted view of the truth, which has been highly damaging. During the pandemic period, independent media outlets were not restricted in the curious way that legacy media outfits were. That's why we know about this stuff, because we heard Jay Bhattacharya, David Martin, Peter McCulloch, Robert Malone, all of that information was being housed on independent media organisations. So accumulatively, people started to acquire at least enough information to ask questions. There was a legitimate challenge, the job that independent media is supposed to do, and indeed an informed public could contribute to that conversation. That's why censorship began at an unprecedented level, an infiltration by deep state agencies. I know these things sound like conspiracy theories, but they're not, are they? Because the Twitter files revealed the deep state agency involvement, the censorship we've all experienced and understand, and new censorship laws are making sure that that ability is enshrined in law in Ireland, the Netherlands, well, not Netherlands now, the UK, Canada, and this has in itself led to new forms of populism, as independent media leads to the rise of new independent political figures. I would say a necessary response to a corrupt establishment, corrupt in the way that we've outlined. We've talked a lot about Big Pharma, we've talked a lot about the state, now we're talking about the role of the legacy media. You already understand it. The figures are in when it comes to mistrust, and now we're starting to piece together how we found ourselves in this astonishing position. Elijah said her biggest concern was about censorship of information online that goes against the narrative, and referred to the Trusted News Initiative, through which the BBC, other publishers and tech giants flag up the most dangerous disinformation to each other. Have a look at this slide. This shows just some of the organisations that are part of it. The New York Times are also part of it, but that's an incredible number of big tech and legacy media organisations participating, and as it says here, informing one another of information that should be de-amplified, censored, shut down, dismissed, dissenters that should be attacked. And you can think straight away, I bet, of a handful of situations where exactly that's happened. Certain messages have been amplified, and where there have been dissenting voices, coordinated attacks have taken place. I've been a recipient of such an attack. The Trusted News Initiative is a partnership founded by the BBC that includes organisations from around the globe, including the Associated Press, the British Broadcasting Corporation, Financial Times, Google, YouTube, Meta, Microsoft, Thomson Reuters, The Washington Post, and ABC Australia. TNI members collectively hold 90% of the overall social media market, a 90% share of the social networking market, 75% of the video hosting market, and over 90% of the search engine market. That is a near monopoly, and it's an invisible near monopoly because it's housed in something that seems almost like a regulatory body. We're all just here to help from the BBC. This is another centralized set of interests that is not democratic, that is deciding for you what information is good for you, what stories to cover, what narratives to amplify, what stories to investigate, where to spend their resources, where not to spend their resources, not looking into excess deaths in spite of several wars worth of death among 35 to 44-year-olds in your country, America. That story is not worth investigating. Dissenting voices, let's spend some time and money finding out ways to shut them down. I know about this personally. You've seen it with Joe Rogan. You've seen it with other voices in this space. How does it happen? Because there is, if not an explicit, an implicit agreement to amplify certain messages, and I would say amplify the message that are beneficial to establishment interests and shut down and control dissent. Now, with these censorship laws that are being posed across the world, this is going to get even easier. The point of these censorship laws is to re-empower legacy media to form partnerships, as you can see from the participants in the TNI, between legacy media and big tech, and to shut out oppositional and dissenting independent media voices. But even the independent media voices are irrelevant. What is it they're doing? They're going, oh, wow, there's a massive gap in the market. You could call it the market. People are interested in the truth, obviously. If we just tell the truth, we can reach millions and millions of people. How are they going to shut that down? By smearing dissenters and by introducing censorship laws. Both of those things are happening globally right now. You've seen it for yourself. You've noticed it, right? Let me know in the chat. By their own admission, members of the Trusted News Initiative agreed to work together and have in fact worked together to exclude from the world's dominant internet platforms rival news publishers who engage in reporting that challenges and competes with TNI members' reporting on certain issues relating to COVID-19 and US politics. The TNI exists to, in its own words, choke off and stamp out online news reporting that the TNI or any of its members peremptorily deems misinformation. And that term, misinformation, is curiously difficult to define. You can still find people online making recommendations and claims for the medications that were introduced during the pandemic period that are palpably and evidently untrue. And yet on YouTube, there are certain things you can't say to this day about ivermectin and adverse injuries from certain products. So misinformation is a term that can be used to essentially shut down information that you don't like. Look specifically at the hate laws that are being introduced in Ireland. There is no specific information on what hate constitutes. Why would that be? So they can decide what hate speech is, so that they can come into your house, investigate your home, snatch your laptop, and claim it's because of hate. What do you mean hate? I mean whatever I want hate to mean. This is what we mean when we talk about the negative impact of globalism. This is what I mean when I say that a bigger threat to democracy is not the populism of Donald Trump or various populist nationalist figures rising up all over the world. In fact, I would contest, and tell me if you agree, that that is a response to the already existent technological dictatorships that are available when you have this degree of monopolization, coordination, cooperation, surveillance, censorship, and shutting down of dissent. This is what dictatorship is now. It's dictatorship where you can still get an ice cream. It's a dictatorship where you're still free to post a selfie of yourself on Instagram, getting your latest booster shot. A dictatorship where you don't know you're in it. That's the best kind of dictatorship of all. You're in a tiny little glistening, glitter-smothered cube of idiocy, but you believe me, if you try and break out of it, you will see the hard edges of fascism. For a long time, we've been in the dark era of censorship that's been embodied by the Trusted News Initiative, which cuts across big tech and all mainstream media, Elijah said. It's been packaged around this war on disinformation or misinformation, where anything that's gone against the official narrative has not just been fact-checked, but has been suppressed or removed. You will already be aware of the curious ways that Meta and Reuters fact-check and some of the curious financial relationships and funding in both of those instances. We'll talk about it more on this channel. Let me know in the chat if you're familiar with that. Ex-BBC radio journalist Tony Gosling pointed out one example to a BBC Newsround segment in which a contributor claimed the Pfizer vaccine was 100% safe for 12 to 15-year-olds. That is categorically misinformation. That is empirically, demonstrably misinformation now. Gosling said, our main concern is that there's a very powerful lobby behind many of these COVID measures, including treatment, lack of treatment, and vaccines, obviously. But there isn't much of a lobby in the other direction. And I think most of us feel that our employers of various sorts have not been representing both sides. Gosling added, my own aim is to provide balance. That's it, basically. And also to point out to the public that journalists don't always get to choose what gets published. It's the owners and the editors that have the final say. So we're all of the same mind that we would like to see more journalists being editors and having their own newspapers, having their own TV radio stations, but that's very, very rare. But with independent media, that can become entirely possible. You'll remember from the beginning of this segment, there was more trust in local news than in other forms of news. The further the information gets from you, the more globalist it becomes, the more centralized it becomes, the more authoritarian it becomes, the more likely it is to have been co-opted by globalist agencies that are funded in dubious ways, you know that already, and corporate interests. If it's local, if it's democratic, if it's controlled by the people, if it's responding to you and your requirements, if essentially you run your communities, you run your media, you're able to interact, well, not only is that closer to the way we lived for thousands and thousands of years, it just makes sense. Why would we benefit from centralizing resources? Why would we benefit by granting authority and power to all of these agencies, whether it's the TNI, the WEF, the WHO, the IMF, the World Bank? It seems to me that all of these agencies that start off with very grand ideas about managing a global economy or managing health crises, always one way or another seem to end up advancing the interests of the powerful. Have you noticed that? Is it me, or during the pandemic period, was there a wealth transfer where ordinary people and small businesses benefited? Or was there a wealth transfer where the most powerful interests in the world benefit? Meanwhile, the state is granted the ability to regulate and ordinary people are not given the ability to respond. And those of us that dissented are shut down with various degrees of extraordinary measures. Censorship, surveillance, lies, propaganda. This is what authoritarianism looks like now. This is what it is to live in a dictatorship. Just because it doesn't look like 20th century boots on the ground and mad red and white flags, it doesn't mean that we haven't yielded to unprecedented power. And the Trusted News Initiative, for all of its recognizable brands and cozy language about helping you not fall prey to misinformation, I believe is an important pillar in this new globalist tyranny. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments in the chat? Remember, we stream every day and we will be back from this time with a fantastic, I'm going to say, banging week of incredible guests in our first season back. More important than any of that, though, is if you can, please stay free. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.